Our scripture passage is back in Proverbs this morning in chapter 26. Like snow in summer or rain in harvest, so honor is not fitting for a fool. Like a sparrow in its flitting, like a swallow in its flying, a curse that is causeless does not alight. A whip for the horse, a bridle for the donkey, and a rod for the back of fools. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. Whoever sends a message by the hand of a fool cut off his own feet and drinks violence. Like a lame man's legs, which hang useless, is a proverb in the mouth of fools. Like one who binds the stone in the sling is the one who gives honor to a fool. Like a thorn that goes up into the hand of a drunkard is a proverb in the mouth of fools. Like an archer who wounds everyone is one who hires a passing fool or drunkard. Like a dog that returns to his vomit is a fool who repeats his folly. Do you see a man who is wise in his own eyes? There is more hope for a fool than for him. The sluggard says, there is a lion in the road, there is a lion in the streets. As a door turns on its hinges, so does a sluggard on his bed. The sluggard buries his hand in the dish. It wears him out to bring it back to his mouth. The sluggard is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can answer sensibly. Whoever meddles in a quarrel not his own is like one who takes a passing dog by the ears. Like a madman who throws firebrands, arrows, and death is the man who deceives his neighbor and says, I am only joking. For lack of wood, the fire goes out, and where there is no whisper, quarreling ceases. As charcoal to hot embers and wood to fire, so is a quarrelsome man for kindling strife. The words of a whisperer are like delicious morsels. They go down into the inner parts of the body. Like the glaze covering an earthen vessel are fervent lips with an evil heart. Whoever hates disguises himself with his lips and harbors deceit in his heart. When he speaks graciously, believe him not, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. Though his hatred be covered with deception, his wickedness will be exposed in the assembly. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it, and a stone will come back on him who starts it rolling. A lying tongue hates its victims, and a flattering mouth works ruin.
Thanks, Nikki. Well, we're continuing our study in the book of Proverbs together this morning. And as Nikki just read, today we're in Proverbs 26. And so if you've been with us for much of this Proverbs series, you've heard us explain several times that this section of Proverbs that we've been in since the beginning of August at this point, it's made up of hundreds of these short wisdom sayings or proverbs, and there are way too many of them to preach through line by line like we normally would do with other books that we preach through. And we've said that a bunch over the last few months. But this morning, that's actually what we're going to do. And I'm going to do my best to have you out of here by about 1 o'clock or so, if that's. But I'm kidding, maybe. But the reason why the proverbs in this section seem to be more organized into groups is that the reason the Proverbs in this section seem to be more organized into groups that are connected to each other by common words or themes. So there's a group of Proverbs that runs from verses 1 through 12 that, other than verse 2, all use the word fool. And then that's followed by a group of 4 Proverbs on the sluggard, which is followed by little groups of Proverbs dealing with quarreling, whispering, and deceiving. And so we could focus on any of those groups of Proverbs and the theme of that one little collection, but the groups of Proverbs in this chapter also work together to collectively make a stronger point than if we just took any one of them separately. And that point then, which you can see from the title of this sermon, is recognizing and responding to fools. That's explicitly the point of verses 1 through 12, but the rest of the chapter supplements those verses and adds some important depth to that point. So that's what we're going to look at this morning. That's where we're headed this morning. We're going to walk through Proverbs 26 together, and the lessons here in this chapter related to recognizing and responding to fools. And so this is a timely topic for us this morning, and not because we're all about to go gather together with family and friends for Thanksgiving this week. And I'm going to hold myself back from connecting any of this to those of you who put up your Christmas trees already or started playing Christmas music before Thanksgiving, although that could easily be added to that list of things there in verse 1 that are not fitting. But the reality is our hyper-connected social media age has created this environment where we have access to and are being bombarded with information and ideas and theories and hot takes from influencers and experts and celebrities, very few of whom we actually personally know. And we're being pressured more and more to know it all and have an opinion on it all and respond to it all. And we have the ability to do that, to add to all that flood of information ourselves or share that information with others in ways that were unimaginable even 20 years ago. And so in the middle of all that, like, how in the world do you determine who's telling the truth and who you can trust? What information is reliable and what isn't? What you ought to respond to or share and what you shouldn't? How you ought to respond to the things that you do respond to? And then there's the people that you actually do know that are also being bombarded by the same things, but are responding to different things than you would respond to, and in different ways than you would respond to those things. And so how do you respond to that? And then take all the hot button social media type issues off the table and just think about the relationships that we're all navigating every day. Kids with your siblings or friends at school, adults with your families or roommates or neighbors or people at work. Like, how do you recognize and respond to foolishness and those kinds of relationships in everyday life? Well, Proverbs 26 isn't going to give us the specific answers that we want to all those questions, but that's not the purpose of wisdom literature. The purpose is to teach us principles that as we meditate on them will shape our lives and our actions across a broad spectrum of situations. And so that's what we're going to see here. We're going to see principles that as we meditate on them and apply them can be extremely helpful when it comes to each of us wrestling through these questions in our different situations. And so you can see there where we're headed on your handout. First, we're going to see some right ways and some wrong ways to respond to fools in verses 1 to 5. Then we're going to see the danger of not responding appropriately to fools in verses 6 to 10. Then we'll see what I'm calling the greatest danger when it comes to responding to fools, woven through verses 6 to 12. And then verse 13 to the end of the chapter, we'll see some specific examples of different kinds of fools and draw out from that some ways to recognize fools. And then at the end, we'll pull all that together and draw out 3 implications of how all this applies to us and helps us recognize and respond to fools. And so that's a lot to get through. And so we're going to have to fly through a lot of this and not go as deep as I wish we could in some places. But my prayer is that all of this would spark thoughts in your own mind and heart and conversations with others that would help you and help us as a church grow in wisdom in this area. So let's look first at Proverbs 26, 1 to 5, and we'll see first some right ways and wrong ways to respond to fools. So in these 5 verses here, you actually have 2 groups of Proverbs. Verses 1 to 3 go together, and verses 4 and 5 go together. So verses 1 to 3 are organized around things that don't go together and things that do go together. So we see that first in verse 1 here. It says, like snow in summer or rain in harvest, so honor is not fitting for a fool. So I'm not a farmer, but I can imagine that rain is not ideal when you're trying to harvest your crops. Those 2 things don't go together. Rain is actually harmful when you're trying to bring in a harvest. And the same is true with snow in the summer. That one I do have opinions about. Those of you who know me know that I don't really love snow in winter either, but it definitely doesn't belong in the summer. If it's snowing in summer, something is gone really wrong with the weather patterns. And again, even if those of you who do enjoy snow know that there's a time and a place for it, And outside of that time and place, it's actually harmful. We just actually passed 25-year anniversary of the October surprise snowstorm here in Kansas City. Does anybody remember that? Some of you are old enough to remember that. We got 6.5 inches of snow on October 22nd, 1996. And so like that wasn't even summer. But if you remember that, because the trees still had all their leaves on it, that snow caused all kinds of damage and problems. So this verse is saying that in the same way, two other things don't go together. They're not fitting in that sense. Honor and fools. And so honor here is a word that's often used for the glory of God. It's a word that has to do with weight or heaviness. And so the idea here is that it's not fitting to give glory or social weight or social respect to someone who is a fool. And so we'll see as we get into verses 6 to 10 that could look like entrusting this person with an important job or task. But in general, it also just has the idea of affirming someone who is a fool in any other way. So praising them, putting your stamp of approval on them somehow, lifting them up in the eyes of others. And the point in all that is that just like rain in harvest or snow in summer not only doesn't go together, it causes damage and harm. Affirming a fool and putting your stamp of approval on them doesn't fit because it causes damage and harm as well. It makes that person less likely to turn away from their foolishness, and it makes others more likely to follow along and join in to their foolishness. So that's the first wrong way to respond to fools, to honor them. Verse 2 gives kind of the opposite picture of something that doesn't go together, where verse 1 was about giving something good to someone bad. Verse 2 is about trying to give something bad to someone good. And so the word for curse there, it's kind of the opposite of the word for honor in verse 1. Honor means heavy. Curse there means light or flighty, which makes sense why the picture of birds is used to illustrate it there. But the point is that none of these things in verses 1 or 2 go together. Honor and fools, curses and someone who doesn't deserve it, none of those things go together. Verse 3 then gives us things that do go together. So verse 3 says, a whip for the horse, a bridle for the donkey, and a rod for the back of fools. So this verse seems kind of harsh to us, like at every one of those comparisons in a sense nowadays. But Solomon says that the things that go together here are whips for horses, bridles for donkeys, and a rod for the back of fools. And so the rod here is exactly what it sounds like. It's physical punishment, beating them with a rod. Like that's what fools deserve. And in some ways, Proverbs all the way through has been arguing that that's the only way to get through to and transform a fool. And so before I say anything to soften that, like we need to feel the seriousness of that. Like that's how serious foolishness is and how difficult it is to turn a fool away from their foolishness. But that being said, it's important to understand the cultural context here. Solomon and his son, who he's writing these proverbs for, and even Hezekiah's men who are organizing these specific proverbs, are in positions of ruling over the nation of Israel. So they have the responsibility and the authority to carry out this kind of punishment. We do not. Everybody with me? Like, this verse is not giving us permission to go around beating people that we think are fools, okay? That's really important. But at the same time, we can draw some principles from this that help us learn about the right way to respond to fools. So just the illustrations that are given here. A whip is used to correct a horse when it's going off the path, right? It's headed the wrong way. And so you use a whip to get its attention and turn it around the right way. You also use a whip to spur it on in the right direction and make it go faster in the way that it ought to go. A bridle is used to steer and direct a donkey to go the right way as well. You put the bit in its mouth and the bridle on it so that you can actually steer this thing where you want it to go. And it's also used, again, to urge it on in the way that it should go. And so the point is that the rod for the fool has the same effect. It rebukes and restrains them from the foolish path that leads to death, and it spurs them on to follow the wise path that leads to life. And both of those things are things that we can do through other means of correction. So that's the principle here. The right way to respond to fools is to correct them, to do what you can to stop them from going down the foolish path that ends in death and urge them toward the wise path that leads to life. Like, that's the first set of wrong and right responses here in verses 1 to 3. Second set then is in verses 4 and 5. Verses 4 and 5 here are kind of famous because at first glance, they sound like they completely contradict each other, right? Like, read back through these again. Answer not a fool according to his folly, verse 4, lest you be like him yourself. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise, in his own eyes. So verse 4 tells us to answer not a fool according to his folly, and then verse 5 tells us to answer a fool according to his folly. So which one is it? Are we supposed to not answer them or answer them? Well, I don't think this is a situation where there's a contradiction in the Bible, especially with these verses being back to back, like Solomon or Hezekiah's men. There's no way that they missed that. So there must be a point to these verses being put back to back like this. So what I think is going on here is that this phrase, according to his folly, is being used differently in each of these verses to teach us one wrong way to respond to fools and one right way. And so the wrong way is to respond according to his folly in the sense of responding in kind. That's what you can see next there on your handout. So in verse 4, the phrase, according to his folly, means answering him in a way that's basically doing exactly what characterizes the fool. The second half of verse 4 makes that clear, that if you do this, you're going to be just like him. So the point here is that our methods of responding to fools matters. Like, if you lower yourself to the fool's level in how you respond to them, how are you any different than them? Like, the way to show their folly as what it is to respond to them in a totally different way. So the wrong way to respond to fools, then, is to respond with the same kind of anger, snark, shaming, gossip, disrespect, meanness, or anything else that would characterize fools. Verse 5 here, then, is used to balance that out and to make sure that we don't misunderstand verse 4 as saying that we should just not respond to fools at all. That's the next point. The right way to respond to fools is by addressing their foolishness. So that's the way, according to their folly, is used in verse 5. It means to actually expose and address the foolishness of the fool. And we need that, right? Like, we need that verse, we need that instruction, because responding to fools it can be really uncomfortable, it can be awkward, and at worst, it can be dangerous, right? I mean, like, we've seen this in other places in Proverbs. Proverbs 9, 7 and 8 says, whoever corrects a scoffer gets himself abuse, and he who reproves a wicked man incurs injury. Do not reprove a scoffer, or he will hate you. Proverbs 29:9 says, if a wise man has an argument with a fool, the fool only rages and laughs, and there is no quiet. So, and there's other verses throughout Proverbs that say similar things. So, like, if you try to respond to a fool, likely they're not going to listen. They'll probably get mad at you, and they might even turn on you and hurt you. So, like, isn't it better to just let it go? I mean, it kind of seems like, let's just avoid that, right? But that's what Proverbs 26:5 is warning us against. Like, it says the right way to respond to a fool is to answer them according to their folly, to expose and address their foolishness. But again, the connection with verse 4 limits how we go about doing that. As we do that, we don't do it in a way that reflects the foolishness we are responding to. So both our response and the methods we use in responding are part of exposing and addressing the foolishness of the fool. So this is far from an exhaustive list, but those are 4 principles that help us see some right ways and wrong ways to respond to fools. And so all that raises the question then, why? Like, why should we care about responding to fools the right way and not the wrong way? Well, I mean, there's a lot of reasons that we could talk about, but the next section of Proverbs 26 highlights a couple of dangers of not responding appropriately to fools. Verses 6 through 10 give some examples of situations where someone didn't respond the right way and did respond the wrong way to a fool. Like, instead of correcting them, we'll see in these verses, they honored them. And so look at these verses and see what happens. Verse 6 through 10 here in Proverbs 26 says, whoever sends a message by the hand of a fool cuts off his own feet and drinks violence. Like a lame man's legs, which hang useless, is a proverb in the mouth of fools. Like one who binds the stone in the sling is one who gives honor to a fool. Like a thorn that goes up into the hand of a drunkard is a proverb in the mouth of fools. Like an archer who wounds everyone is one who hires a passing fool or a drunkard. So all these verses kind of go together, and they're set off kind of verses 6 and 10 are kind of the bookends. And in both of those, someone is hiring a fool to do an important job. Then the middle verse, verse 8, connects directly back to verse 1 about giving honor to a fool. And so, that's what this group of Proverbs is about. And so then all the way through this, you have these really vivid descriptions then of the consequences of when you do that, of when you hire a fool, when you give honor to a fool. And there's a spectrum here that this represents, but it gives us kind of the two opposite ends, the two extreme ends of the spectrum that are highlighted in these illustrations. And so on the one end, verse 7 is probably the clearest picture of the first end of the spectrum. You can see this on your handout. At best, the fool is useless and does no positive good. That's what verse 7 is basically getting at. So this is kind of the best case scenario when you don't respond appropriately to a fool. Like they don't do any harm, but they don't do any good either. Verse 7 there compares them to a lame man's legs. Like he can't stand on them, he can't walk on them. They're not necessarily doing him any harm, but they're not doing the good for him that legs ought to do. And so the point here when it comes to the danger of not responding appropriately to fools is that we shouldn't be okay with that outcome. Like there can be a temptation to see that outcome as no big deal. But the thing is, like, we're not supposed to just be against doing harm. We're supposed to be for doing good. And so if by not responding appropriately to a fool, we create a situation where no harm's being done, but no good is either, like we shouldn't be okay with that. We didn't handle that situation the right way. And again, that's the best case scenario. On the other hand, every other verse in this section primarily focuses on the other end of the spectrum, which you can see next on your handout there. At worst, the fool is dangerous and does actual harm. Verse 6 says if you send a fool as a messenger, basically entrusting them to represent you and speak for you, you might as well be cutting off your own feet and drinking violence. Like neither one of those sounds like a good idea. And so it's not clear here whether the person knew this person was a fool in the first place and sent them as their messenger anyway, or whether they didn't realize they were sending the wrong person until it's too late. But the point's the same. Like you better know who you're sending before you send them. You better recognize and respond appropriately to fools, or it will do you actual harm. Verse 8 says that giving honor to a fool is like tying a stone in a sling. And so picture here the story of David and Goliath, right? That's kind of the sling that we're all familiar with is in that story. David puts a stone in his sling, swings it around, and then launches it at Goliath's head, right? Well, what if David instead tied the stone in the sling? Now he's swinging around a rock on a string, and what do you think's going to happen? Like it's going to come flying back at his own head, right? Like, so you can see again the harm that not recognizing and responding to fools does. Verse 9, the first part of verse 9 in the ESV here reads, like a thorn that goes up into the hand of a drunkard. It's a little bit confusing phrase, but like if that's the right understanding of that verse, then the point would be that it'd be like a drunk person doesn't feel the thorn. And so it would be somewhat parallel to the point of verse 7. But some other translations, like the ESV or the CSB, translate it something to the effect of like a thorn bush in a drunkard's hand is a proverb in the mouth of a fool. And so if that's what the proverb's picturing, it's like a drunk person with a thorn bush in their hand, stumbling around, waving it around everywhere. And I'm not going to act that out for you, but you can picture that, right? Like they have no idea where they're going, what they're doing. They can't control where they're swinging this thing. And so they're hurting people and damaging things everywhere. Which that's also the point of verse 10 there, where you have an archer just shooting arrows willy-nilly every which way. So instead of doing good by shooting something for dinner or shooting at an enemy target, they're hurting everyone and they're incredibly dangerous. And so that's the other end of the spectrum. Like at best, responding the wrong way to fools puts the fool in a position where they don't necessarily do any harm, but they don't do any good either. And at worst, it puts them in a position where they're incredibly dangerous and do actual harm to everyone around them. And the point is that neither one of those are good outcomes. Like, that's why it matters so much that we respond the right way to fools. But here's the thing in these verses that's kind of easy to miss at first. And this is the next main point on your handout here. And again, calling this the greatest danger when it comes to responding to fools. Here's the thing. The greatest danger when it comes to responding to fools is woven through those verses we just looked at, and then also including verses 11 and 12. And so you can see this on your handout here, and it's this. It's misidentifying who the fool is. Misidentifying who the fool is. And so here's what I mean by that. First of all, you can see in verses 7 and 9, someone can use wise words and still be a fool. And so in both those verses, 7 and 9, the comparison there is to a proverb in the mouth of a fool. It kind of stands out within that pattern as being a little bit different there in those verses. And so the point is there that it's possible for a fool to use wise words, to even use some of the proverbs from this book, which would make them sound as if they're wise. But they don't understand the proverbs they're using, and so they use them the wrong way and apply them to the wrong situations with one of the same two results that we just talked about. It's either useless the way they use it and it does no one any good, or it's dangerous the way they use it and it actually does harm. So the warning in that is that just because someone uses wise words and sounds wise doesn't mean they are. What matters is whether they're using those wise words in the right way and applying them in the right way, which means that what matters isn't using wise words, it's being a wise person, which takes a lot of discernment on the part of the hearers to see through the words someone is using to the person themselves. So that's one way you can end up with the situations depicted in verses 6, 8, and 10, where you honor or give an important responsibility to someone who's actually a fool because you fell for the wise words coming out of their mouth and didn't see through to their character. Which leads to the next point woven through these verses. And you can see this next on your handout. And this is really the central question is who's the greater fool? Like, did you pick up on that as we were reading these verses? In most of these verses, while it's 100% true that the fool is dangerous and harmful, who is it that's actually the subject of all of these proverbs? Look at verses 6 and 10 first. Verse 6, whoever sends a message by the hand of a fool cuts off his own feet and drinks violence. And verse 10, like an archer who wounds everyone is one who hires a passing fool or drunkard. So it's not the fool who does the damage in either of those verses. It's the one who hires him, right? So like, who's the greater fool here? The fool or the one who hires him or gives him an important responsibility? You see the same thing in verse 8. It says, like, one who binds a stone in a sling is one who gives honor to a fool. So again, it's not the fool who binds the stone in the sling. It's the one who gives honor to the fool. So who's the greater fool, the fool or the one who honors him? Oh, and then look at verse 11 and 12 that we haven't looked at yet. Verse 11, like a dog that returns to his vomit is a fool who repeats his folly. So it's a graphic illustration of a fool, right? Like a dog that returns to his vomit. And so not to dwell on that picture too much, but the reason the dog vomited in the first place is because whatever it ate didn't agree with it, right? So not only is this gross, but how foolish is it to go back and try again, right? Like, that's what verse 11 is saying the fool does. I mean, like, that's pretty foolish. But then look at verse 12. Oh, verse 12. Do you see a man who's wise in his own eyes? There is more hope for a fool than for him. Oh my goodness, like, if that doesn't wake you up after everything we just looked at, I mean, like, look at that again. Like, do you see a man who's wise in his own eyes? There's more hope for a fool than for him. So up until this point, there's kind of been two categories of people, right? There's the fool on the one hand who needs to not be honored but instead be corrected. And then there's the one who's recognizing and responding to the fool. And so I don't know if you're like me, but up until this point, which category have you been putting yourself in? Probably the category of those who are recognizing and responding to the fool, right? Like, the fool is someone else. We're the ones who need to be on the lookout for them and ready to respond to them. And if we're honest, as we're going through these verses, we're kind of looking down on how foolish the fool is, especially this picture of the fool in verse 11 here. And then verse 12 comes along and turns this whole thing upside down. Like it's basically saying, you see how dangerous the fool is, how difficult it is to turn them away from the foolish path? Well, guess what? The person who's wise in their own eyes is in even worse shape than them. Like there's more hope for the fool than for them. So the greatest danger here, the greatest danger when it comes to responding to fools is misidentifying who the fool is. And the point here is, who's the greater fool? The fool or the one who thinks they're better than him? Which again, it turns this whole thing around. It's like the prophet Nathan coming to David after his sin with Bathsheba, telling David this story that got David all stirred up about the rich man who would take the poor man's one lamb and then telling David, you are the man. Like that's why this is the greatest danger when it comes to recognizing and responding to fools. Like if we only see the foolishness in others and our category of fools is all out there, we'll end up finding ourselves in this category of those who are wise in their own eyes, who are in even more danger than the fool. So as we think about recognizing and responding to fools, like we have to be thinking on both levels here. Yes, how do we recognize and respond to foolishness in others? But also, and even first, how do I recognize and respond to the foolishness in me? And so that's where the rest of this chapter adds some helpful depth to everything we've talked about so far. Like so far, this category of fool has been kind of vague. But the rest of the chapter gives us some specific ways to recognize fools. And so we're going to have to fly through these. But I want you to think about these characteristics in light of everything that we've just talked about. Like, do you see these characteristics in people around you or in the voices that you're listening to? And are you responding appropriately where you are? And do you see these characteristics in yourself? And are you responding appropriately where you are there too? So really, even before we get to the first one in your handout, like you could pencil in the point that we just talked about at the top of this list. I probably should have included that on this list, that number one, they're wise in their own eyes, verse 12. So if you want to add that to the list, you can. But also, the first one that you have on your list here is they're lazy. They're lazy, verses 13 to 16, chapter 26. So John preached a whole sermon on the sluggard a couple weeks ago out of Proverbs 24, but he also included these 4 verses in that sermon and unpacked them really well. So I'm not going to spend time doing that again. If you missed that before, go back and listen to it. It was a super helpful sermon. And so, but the point here in those verses is just that this is one way you can recognize a fool, is that they're lazy. Second, they meddle in conflicts that have nothing to do with them. You see that in verse 17. Look at that one. It says, whoever meddles in a quarrel not his own is like one who takes a passing dog by the ears. So dogs in Israel at this time, they're semi-wild and kind of ran around everywhere, scavenging in the streets. And so like this isn't a pet. This is a dangerous dog. This is a semi-wild dog. And so the picture here is someone seeing one of these dogs just going by them on the street and jumping over there, grabbing this thing by the ears. Like that's not very smart because that's going to make it mad. And if you let go of the ears, you're going to get the teeth, right? There's no way to let go of it without it getting you at that point. So it's not a very smart move. And so the point of this proverb is that it's foolish to meddle in conflicts that have nothing to do with you. So that's another way to recognize a fool. They're constantly getting into the middle of fights that didn't involve them to begin with. Third, they stir up trouble for fun. We see that in verses 18 and 19. It says, like a madman who throws firebrands, arrows, and death is the man who deceives his neighbor and says, I'm only joking. So this isn't saying that you can never joke with anybody, okay? It's not saying you can't ever joke with anybody. To deceive somebody here means to design a scheme to mislead and harm someone. Like it's mean and hurtful. And so the point here is that it should be obvious that there's a difference between hurting someone and joking with them. But the fool doesn't know the difference. Or it could be that he's just using this as an excuse to avoid getting in trouble when he gets caught. So he stirs up trouble by misleading and hurting people. And then when he's caught and confronted, his response is, come on, it's just a joke. Those are the two things that this is dealing with here. That's another way to recognize fools. They stir up trouble for fun or use fun as a cover for stirring up trouble. Fourth, then, they fan the flames of conflict through gossiping and grumbling. You see that in verses 20 to 22. And so, there's so much we could get to in these verses. I thought about even just focusing in on these, but we'll just fly through this. But this is very appropriate in a lot of ways in my own heart and around us right now. Verse 20, for lack of wood, the fire goes out, and where there is no whisperer, quarreling ceases. And so the whisperer here could mean a couple of things. One would be gossip. That's probably the one that we think of first as the most natural way to read this. Gossip is when someone spreads information about someone else, not to help them, but to hurt them. Or maybe it's more about making the person sharing the information look good, but it does damage to the other person in the process. And the thing with gossip is the information being shared may very well be true. The problem is just that information is being given to inappropriate people at an inappropriate time, and it's being shared out of love for self rather than love for the other person. That's what this has in mind here for sure. Whispering is gossiping. The other thing that whispering could have in mind here, though, is grumbling as well. This same word is used of Israel in the wilderness, complaining and grumbling against God. Man, I fight this in my own heart. We know people like this that are always complaining about something, grumbling about something. That's the other thing that the whisperer here could have in mind. So the whisperer can be a gossip or a grumbler. And the point of this proverb is that just like if you stop adding wood to a fire, the fire goes out. The point is if you remove a whisperer, quarreling goes out. And so then that image of a fire then carries over into verse 21. It says, as charcoal to hot embers and wood to fire, so is a quarrelsome man for kindling strife. So this is kind of the opposite picture. Verse 20, if you stop adding wood to the fire, it goes out. Here, if you add charcoal to hot embers or wood to a fire, it flares up, right? So you have this picture of a quarrelsome person fanning the flames of conflict. And in connection with the previous verse, they're probably doing that by gossiping or grumbling. And verse 22 explains why that happens. Verse 22 says, the words of a whisperer are like delicious morsels. They go down into the inner parts of the body. And oh man, isn't that true? Like the words of a whisperer, their gossip, their grumbling, they're like delicious morsels. Like there's just something in us that can hardly resist gossip or grumbling. Like we get drawn into it, we swallow it down, and it just begins to take root in us. So this is a particularly dangerous kind of fool to watch out for, one who fans the flames of conflict through gossiping and grumbling. And then the fifth and final way to recognize fools here, verses 23 through 28, they hide hatred behind flattery and deceptive speech. Verses 23 through 28 say, like the glaze covering an earthen vessel are fervent lips with an evil heart. Whoever hates disguises himself with his lips and harbors deceit in his heart. When he speaks graciously, believe him not, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. Though his hatred be covered with deception, his wickedness will be exposed in the assembly. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it, and a stone will come back on him who starts it rolling. A lying tongue hates its victims, and a flattering mouth works ruin. So verse 23 is kind of the picture that the rest of this unpacks, and this picture is of a clay pot covered with a glaze, or if you have the ESV there, you probably have a footnote that says that could also be translated as silver of dross. So the idea here is that this is a cheap pot that's been painted over with a glaze or a silver coating of some sort that makes it look fancy and expensive. And so that's then what the rest of these verses unpack, is someone using their words to cover the reality in their heart and deceive someone into thinking that they love them and are for them, when in reality they're against them and hate them. That word hate comes up in every other verse through this whole section. So verse 24, 26, 28, like that's what's actually in this person's heart. But then they use fervent lips, gracious speech, deception, lies, and flattery to disguise their hatred and to give the exact opposite impression. And so there's so much we could get into in these verses as well, but this is a fifth way to recognize a fool. Like, they're characterized by hiding hatred behind flattery and deceptive speech, which again is tricky. We talked about this some before. When someone is hiding something behind their speech, like, it can be really hard to spot. Like, they say all the right things and they're really convincing that they're trustworthy and that they're for you, but that's the point here, is that you have to learn how to see through the flattery and deception so that you can respond appropriately to this kind of fool. So there are more that could be added to this list, but there are 5 here in this chapter, or 6 if you add verse 12. There's 5 ways to recognize fools. And so we've covered a lot here. Some right ways and wrong ways to respond to fools, the danger of not responding appropriately to fools, greatest danger when it comes to responding to fools, which is misidentifying who the fool is, some specific ways to recognize fools. So the question at this point is just, what do we do with all that? And so again, the goal of wisdom literature is for you to meditate on these principles and have them shape your responses in your specific situation. And so there's always danger in getting too specific in some of the implications, but at the same time, I think it's helpful to draw out a few implications based on everything we talked about. And so let's close out by doing that together this morning. And so first, you can see this there on your handout. First implication is to recognize and respond to your own foolishness first. Recognize and respond to your own foolishness first. And so if you couldn't tell, verse 12 is definitely the proverb in this chapter that hit home with me the hardest this week. And so, we can be so quick to recognize and look down on foolishness in others, and so slow to recognize it in ourselves. Like, it is so easy to put ourselves in the category of the wise person who needs to recognize and respond to all the foolishness around us. But the reality is that attitude exposes us as not being wise, but as being wise in our own eyes, which ultimately puts us in a more dangerous category of foolishness than the fool. And not only that, like, if we're honest, then the descriptions of fools in verses 13 to 28 describe us in more ways than we want to admit. So if we're going to ever be able to recognize and respond rightly to fools the way the Proverbs here in chapter 26 call us to, it has to start with first recognizing and responding to the foolishness in ourselves. So really practically, here's a couple things that I'd encourage you to do. Number one, just which of these characteristics of fools tends to describe you the most? I'd encourage you to go back to that list, circle the ones that you struggle with the most, and then consider what steps you need to take to respond rightly now that you recognize that foolishness in yourself. Like, what steps do you need to take to walk in repentance in that area? Here's maybe a couple of suggestions, just to get super practical. First, just take some time to confess that sin to God and ask him to forgive you. Maybe you also need to confess it to some others and ask for their forgiveness as well. Then second, pray that God would change your heart in that area. Like, true transformation comes from the inside out. Like, good fruit grows from a healthy tree. So we've got to pray that God would transform your heart so that you would no longer be characterized by that foolishness. And then third, think of some practical steps of obedience you could begin to take to cut off patterns of foolishness in that area. So just think through things like, what is feeding that particular foolishness in your life? Where is that foolishness expressing itself in your words or actions? Take some time to really evaluate what things might need to go, or what things you might need to make some serious adjustments to cut off the patterns of foolishness that you see in your life. So that's the first step, though, when it comes to recognizing and responding to fools, is recognizing and responding to your own foolishness first. It's just like Jesus said in Matthew 7, starting verse 3, says, "Why do you see the speck that's in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that's in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when there's a log in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." That's what we're talking about here, which leads to the second implication, though, and you can see that next, is to be prepared to recognize and respond to foolishness in others. So as important as that last point is, if we don't then get to this one, we're missing the point of this passage. Like that really is the main point in verses 1 to 10 in particular, to rightly recognize and rightly respond to foolishness in others. And again, Proverbs 26 doesn't say everything there is to say about this, but it does have a few principles that we can apply. And so really practically, just to unpack what we learned from this passage here. Number one, just be careful about putting your stamp of approval on anyone who's characterized by foolishness. Like that's the primary warning in verses 1 to 10, to see the danger of giving honor to fools and be really slow to do anything that would affirm or put your stamp of approval on or share or anything, someone who would be characterized by any of the things that we saw in this chapter or any of the other ways foolishness has been described throughout Proverbs. That's the first implication. Second, then, would just be to see the importance of not allowing foolishness to go unchecked. Like that can be tricky because we're not all in positions to address all of the foolishness we see. That's one of the things that our social media world distorts. It allows us to see foolishness everywhere, and it makes us feel like we're called to respond to all of it, and we're not. And so it takes discernment to know which situations specifically that we need to step into and be the one or one of the ones to expose and correct foolishness in someone. Because remember, the harm that allowing foolishness to go unchecked causes others. And remember, the harm that allowing foolishness to go unchecked causes the person caught in foolishness, both in this life and ultimately eternally. Like that's been the point all the way through the book of Proverbs. The foolish path ends in death. Like we cannot just stand by and watch people go on their merry way down that path without doing what we can to try to stop them and turn them around. So one of the implications of this passage is definitely to prayerfully consider whether there's anyone that God has you in a position to do that for, which flows out of the first implication that we talked about, though, that as we're doing the work of recognizing and responding to the foolishness in our own hearts and lives, then we'll be in a position to be humbly led by the Spirit to recognize and respond to foolishness in others out of genuine love and concern for them and for those who would be hurt by their foolishness, which affects the way that we respond to them as well, which is the other part of this. Like we must be prepared to recognize and respond to foolishness in others, but we must not do so in a way that looks just like the foolishness we're correcting. Like we cannot resort to foolish methods to correct fools. But we can use wisdom to boldly and confidently evaluate each situation that we face and then do what we can to correct foolishness in others in a way that looks different than the foolishness that we're correcting. And all that leads to one final implication here, which ties it all together, is to let the gospel shape how we recognize and respond to foolishness in ourselves and others. And so here's the reality. All of us are fools. We're born that way, because the first man and the first woman chose to decide for themselves what was good and evil instead of submitting to God's definition of good and evil. And so we're born with foolish hearts that want to define wisdom for ourselves and be wise in our own eyes. And because of that, then, we choose the foolish path that leads to death. Romans 1:21 and 22 says, "For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God, nor give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools." Like, that's who we are. That's what we've done. We're born that way, and we have become that way in our actual actions and words. And so because of that, the point in Romans 1 is that all of us then are under God's wrath. And we see that even in Proverbs 26. The fool deserves the rod, and the foolish path ends in death. Like, that's what all of us deserve for our foolishness. Oh, but the gospel, the good news of the gospel is that God sent his son, Jesus, to be born as a human. And he didn't go down the path that we did. He's the only human who's ever lived who perfectly walked the wise path that leads to life. But then what happened to Jesus? He was beaten and he was crucified. He took the beating and the death that we earned and that we deserved for our foolishness. But he took that beating and death. He took the wrath of God as our representative and as our substitute. And so the good news of the gospel is that if you will trust in Jesus' wisdom in your place and his beating and death in your place, if you'll stake everything on Jesus as your substitute, your foolishness can be forgiven and your foolish heart can be transformed. And this doesn't happen all at once, but it begins a life of repentance, of our foolishness being exposed through the Spirit, bringing conviction, through others correcting us, which leads us to confess and ask forgiveness for our foolishness from God and others, and then taking steps of obedience so that more and more our hearts and our lives are characterized by wisdom. Philippians 1:6 promises then that he who began that good work in us will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. And so, do you see then how the gospel shapes then how we recognize and respond to foolishness in ourselves and others? First of all, it gives us hope in light of our own foolishness. Like, apart from the gospel, this would be a depressing, crushing sermon. We'd all have to walk out of here with our heads hung low. But because of the gospel, we can face what Proverbs 26 reveals in our hearts and be honest about it and feel the weight of it and grieve over it. But that coming face to face then with our sinfulness actually causes us to turn more and more away from ourselves and more to Jesus, leaving us more in awe of the magnitude of what he's done for us, and more rejoicing in him and worshiping him and walking out of here praising him that our foolishness doesn't define us anymore. Like we sang earlier, we're free, forever we're free because of the gospel. That's not who we are anymore. And it changes how we respond to foolishness in others. Because the gospel has exposed and dealt with our own foolishness, when we see foolishness in others then, we can respond to it with compassion and concern for the one caught in their foolishness and for those who will be affected or hurt by their foolishness. And then we use the wisdom that God is shaping in us to do what we can to stop them from going down the foolish path that leads to death and point them to the one who has transformed our hearts and can transform theirs as well. That's what the good news of the gospel says about everything that we've seen here in Proverbs 26. And so we see the right ways and the wrong ways to respond to foolishness. We see the dangers of not responding in the right way. We see the greatest danger in our own hearts. We see the characteristics of fools that we need to be looking out for. And then all of that points us to the gospel that deals with our own hearts and then helps us to deal rightly with others. So let's pray and ask God to do that for us. Father, thank you for the words that you give us in the book of Proverbs, the wise sayings that we've been studying all through this book, and how in a lot of ways this brings together a lot of things that we've seen over and over again throughout this book. Just the path of wisdom that leads to life, the path of foolishness that leads to death, calling us to the one path, warning us from the other one. We've seen just illustrations over and over again of what the path of folly looks like, what the path of wisdom looks like. But this one calls us to respond to it in a lot of ways that we need to respond to it. One, just in dealing with our hearts and recognizing the foolishness in ourselves. We're so quick to think that we are wise, to be in that category of wise in our own eyes, to think that all the fools are out there, and to not turn things around on ourselves and see that we're the fool, and in some ways we're even in a more dangerous place than the fool because we don't think that we're the fool. And so God, I pray that you would expose our own hearts in that where we need to be. Humble us, Father, by our foolishness and by even just our attempts to define wisdom ourselves and to be wise in our own eyes rather than submitting to your wisdom and being humbled by the fact that we don't measure up to it. And so, Father, I pray that you would do what needs to happen in each of our hearts through that first, that you would humble us by that we wouldn't run away from that too quickly, that we would allow that to press into our hearts, to humble us, that we would grieve over that. But then that grief over our sin would turn us around then to just be in awe even more of what you've done for us in Christ, that while we were fools, you sent your Son to die for us, to live the perfectly wise life that we failed to live, and then to take the beating and the death that we deserved for our foolishness. And so, Father, pray that for those of us who have put our trust in that, who are banking everything on that, Lord, I pray that this would cause us to just be that much more in awe of the gospel, that much more aware of the depth of our sin, that much more aware of just the magnitude of the grace that we've received in Christ, and pray that we would walk out of here just rightly humbled, but even more than that, just rejoicing in Jesus and what he's done for us. Father, for those that are in this room that haven't come to that point yet, I pray that this would be maybe a moment where a lot of this makes sense, where the gospel makes sense in a new way to them. And so, God, even this morning, be drawing people to yourself, exposing their sin through your Spirit, bringing conviction, and pray that they would put their trust in Jesus as their substitute, who took the beating and the wrath that they deserve for their foolishness, took their sin on himself so that he could credit his righteousness to them, and their sin could be forgiven, their hearts could be transformed. God, then I pray that this would change the way that we respond to those that are around us. Lord, I pray that as we're dealing with our own foolishness, that our hearts would be rightly humbled, and that we would be stirred with compassion for those around us when we see foolishness in others. And pray, God, that out of love and concern and care for others, that we would be quick to step in and stop people from going down that path, but that we wouldn't do it in a way that would reflect the foolishness that used to characterize us. But God, just that we wouldn't be silent either, that we wouldn't be okay with just standing by and watching people go down the foolish path that leads to death. Help us to walk that line carefully of how to respond to people in their foolishness in a way that would actually point them to the wisdom of Jesus, and that would turn them away from the path that leads to death. God, help us with all these things. This is hard. These are hard things to learn and to apply. And so just as we meditate on these principles, as we meditate on these Proverbs, Father, I pray that you would shape us individually and us as a church just to be characterized more and more by wisdom in these areas. In Jesus' name, amen.